sci-fi, horror, fantasy, absurdism in the extreme. It's all available here in the Tales from the Omni Vault book series. Check the description for Amazon links so you can get your copies and start reading today. Thank you all, and now, on to the video. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I'm the Omni Viewer, and a few years ago I made a video about how I'm not overly fond of Godzilla Final Wars. I listed 5 major criticisms in ascending order of importance and said those were the things that kept me from liking it. However, during my first live Q&A, I did mention in passing that my attitude towards it had softened a little, though I didn't elaborate. Well, I think the time for elaboration has finally come. To be clear, this isn't a retraction, right? Oh, not at all, Snazzy. I stand by my initial critiques of Final Wars. Just as a refresher, my major issues with the movie are as follows. Minila's scenes are random and make no sense in the plot, the suits are too form-fitting, which hurts the illusion, the movie is on a permanent sensory overload setting, Godzilla is too overpowered, which leads to the fights being too short, and the overall tone feels like it's more interested in chasing early 2000s Hollywood trends than it is in celebrating Godzilla's half-centennial. I stand by those criticisms, and I'm not retracting any of them, though I will amend a few before the video is done. All the same, though, I think enough time has passed and I'm ready to say some positive things about the movie. To begin with, I didn't initially say much about the human side of the movie beyond its desire to be trendy. And make no mistake, my friends, being trendy is the priority. Any one of these shots could have been ripped straight from an American superhero movie of that era. That being said, though, it's not poorly done. Despite my disappointment that more effort went into these portions than the kaiju portions, I must acknowledge that the effort was not wasted. The action scenes have good choreography, and they're framed with great care and edited to keep the frenetic pace going. This even works for simpler shots, like when the mutants get brainwashed and surround our heroes. All the camera does is push forward until they're out of frame, then pull back until we see them again. But just that simple move completely changes the scene's mood. I should probably also give the actors their due credit. While not the greatest cast ever assembled for a kaiju movie, you can still tell that they're at least having fun in the roles they're given. For example, Kazuki Kitamura knows that the Exilian controller is a cartoon villain, and he hands it up appropriately, managing to be funny without making the character itself a joke. This is what true camp looks like, where you walk that fine line between dramatic and melodramatic, thus making something memorable. Akira Takarada, who was a classy gentleman his whole life, has fun playing not just one, but technically 2 roles since he gets replaced by an imposter early on. In both cases, he brought his A-game just as he did for every role. The man truly was a national treasure. Even if the improbability of his character's survival remains, it's still nice to see him have fun with such an involved role. And it just makes me miss him all the more now that he's no longer with us. But we all know who everyone loves the most, don't we, Omni? Oh, but of course, Snazzy. Everybody loves the man, the myth, the mustache, Don Fry as Captain Douglas Gordon. Everybody loves Don Fry in this movie, and it's not hard to see why. He's playing a real man's man, tough as nails and cool as ice. He strolls into every room like he's the toughest dude in town, and we cannot help but agree. Men want to be him, women want to be with him, and monsters want to end him before he ends them. He's the sort of truly masculine hero that you don't often see these days. The fact that he's speaking plain English while everyone else speaks Japanese just adds to the style. He doesn't need a translator. Don Fry transcends language barriers. I've also grown a new appreciation for Kenta and Samon Taguchi, played by Kenta Suga and Shigeru Izumiya respectively. Who? The grandfather and grandson who go on a road trip with Minilla. Oh yeah, them. Their names don't get brought up that often. No, which is surprising given that the kid's name is literally Kenny. Anyway, like I said in the earlier video, the Minilla subplot is very poorly incorporated into Final Wars. That said, I think I get what these two represent. They stand in for the multi-generational nature of the Godzilla fandom, as exemplified by the scene where Kenta asks his grandpa why Godzilla attacks people. Knowing the boy is too young to really understand, but confident that he will be one day, Samon explains it in a way that makes sense for now. It also sets up how the last scene will play out, but we'll get to that a bit later. Granted, this aspect isn't overly complex, and it still feels out of place in the larger plot. There's no denying that. Still, for what it's worth, those scenes on their own do still add something. And it just makes me wonder what might have been if maybe the movie was a little more focused on the fact that it was a Godzilla 50th anniversary film specifically. One of my critiques in that original video is that I didn't like the way the kaiju suits in Godzilla Final Wars were done. I did mention that I like the designs, but I didn't really say much more than that. Well, I am going to say more now, and since I've got a lot of Final Wars figures in my collection, that means we can get a nice, clear, unobstructed look at all of them. Again, we're just looking at the designs themselves, rather than how they were implemented in the suits. Let's start with the Big G himself. As mentioned, the slimmer designs are meant to give the kaiju a wider range of movement, and this gives Godzilla specifically a different sort of physicality. Usually Godzilla is very bulky, dare I even say hefty, likely inspired a bit by the tradition of sumo wrestling where being large is the whole point. Here, he's slimmer, but he still looks fit and muscular, conveying the idea of a martial artist. Let's also zero in on the head for a moment. I recall initially thinking the head looked a bit like a rat, and there were several contemporary reviews that agreed. The more I look, though, the more I see something reminiscent of a wolf or a fox, the former known for its hunting prowess and the latter known for its cunning. At the right angle, it makes him look especially fierce. In fact, I'd say that's the key word. This is meant to be a fierce-looking, physically fit Godzilla, distinct from previous iterations. Rodan is one of my all-time favorite kaiju, and I have to say that I also love his design here. It clearly harkens back to the original 1956 suit, as evidenced from the shape of the head, though the color is taken straight from the Heisei era. In the finer details, though, he stands out from other interpretations. Consider the horns and tail. Although the overall look is still that of a pterosaur, the texturing of these areas implies the presence of downy feathers, which adds a subtle bird-like quality to him. This, combined with the red coloring, gives Rodan an appearance akin to a phoenix. This was actually my second favorite design before the MonsterVerse Rodan came along. Anguirus, all things considered, didn't change that much, but there is a simple design choice that does wonders for him. As you can see, the spikes on his carapace curl forward slightly, matching the horns that frame his head. It's a simple choice that makes him look more aggressive, since all the points are aimed at whoever he's facing. It becomes a practical element when he curls into a ball and the spikes function like the teeth of a chainsaw. Add to that the armored segments on his tail and a few extra spikes on his limbs, and you have a nice upgraded design that remains recognizable. Manda is given only slight design tweaks, but they help add a nice visual flair. The lateral fins running along the side make him look like a proper aquatic creature, but the overall design is clearly harkening back to the original 1963 version. The teal coloration doesn't amount to much given how he's in the deep murky ocean whenever we see him, but on its own, the color pops nicely among the other kaiju. Hedorah also deserves a look, even if he's hardly in the movie. While still being recognizable, there's a noticeable emphasis on asymmetry. The original Hedorah suit had a bit of asymmetry in her lopsided head, but final Hedorah cranks it up. The right hand is broad while the left hand is narrow. A strange split divides the head into two uneven halves, and tubes jut out from random places. Then you have the eyes. The left eye retains the angled shape of the original Smog Monster, but the right eye is unnaturally round and stares blankly into space. The effect is a creature that looks pretty unnerving. My personal favorite of the bunch has got to be Gigan. Consider the original design, which looks mostly organic, but has features hinting at his cyborg nature. You aren't entirely sure where the biological ends and the mechanical begins with this guy. Final Wars Gigan reinterprets this by taking a cue from H.R. Giger. The Swiss artist developed his own style that blurred the line between artificial and organic, creating something disturbing to look at but also fascinating to take in. Basically, it's perfect for a cyborg like Gigan. It also makes sense since the aesthetic is most famously applied to the xenomorph of the Alien franchise, and Gigan is specified as an alien, so it also works on a meta level. We can see similar textures on Monster X, though in a slightly different manner. The stark contrast of the smooth white portions against the fleshier black portions give the appearance of a creature turned inside out with bone on top of muscle. It makes him look creepy, like the kaiju embodiment of death. Once he becomes Kaiser Ghidorah, well, okay, the useless baby wings are laughable, but there are still some interesting choices made here. For example, I went years without ever fully registering that the three heads are different from each other, specifically in their horn arrangements. This gives the dragon his own form of asymmetry, but unlike with Hedorah, it's subtle, and therefore doesn't consciously register until you really notice it. Again, I'm not fond of how the suits were executed, but I like the designs themselves. The monsters look good and really deserved better. I would say the soundtrack is also worth mentioning as a plus. No, I don't mean how this movie got G-fans into Sum 41, although that impact can't be ignored. I'm talking about the score itself. When it comes to the original music, we actually have 3 composers aboard: Nobuhiko Mano, Daisuke Yano, and Keith Emerson. Hang on, Keith Emerson? As in Emerson, Lake and Palmer Keith Emerson? For real? The very same, though he didn't directly collaborate with the other two. Still, that does make him one of the few British composers to ever work on a Japanese Godzilla film. Huh. So why do people only get hung up on Sum 41? One of life's many mysteries, Snazzy. Anyway, the overall score is a combination of symphonic, electronic, and hard rock. And even setting aside my own thoughts on the movie, it actually sounds pretty good on its own for the most part. The recurring rock leitmotif that accompanies the mutants does a good job enhancing the thrill of the action. Meanwhile, the choral leitmotif for Godzilla lends a bombastic operatic scale to the king. These themes are used exclusively for the characters they represent, as any good theme should be, so they have a greater impact when you hear them. One piece even I'm surprised I'm like is the theme that underscores the credits. Even if the visuals are an epileptic's worst nightmare, the music itself still works. It remixes the classic Akira Ifukube theme with new elements, and the final result is something that occasionally feels gothic in scope, a tone that hasn't been associated with Godzilla since 1984. Granted, not every track is memorable, but those that are, really are. I suppose I can also acknowledge what the movie was ultimately trying to say. Now, the writing of Final Wars is best described as haphazard, with some elements working while other elements don't. Takarada's "I survived somehow" line is officially the "somehow Palpatine returned" of the Godzilla series. All of that makes the themes really sloppy, but I can still acknowledge that there are themes to be found. For starters, we have the human side of the plot. If you really think about it, the idea of the Exilians harvesting humans for food like cattle on a farm is a notion fit for cosmic horror, the sort of revelation that could drive someone to existential despair. Think about it. All of human history, all of our achievements, everything we've ever done, all rendered moot because a race of advanced aliens came down and said they're just farming us like cattle. That is a pretty disparaging revelation. Yet despite this, the remainder of the EDF stands together and proclaims that those aliens are wrong. The Exilians don't get to tell us what our place in the universe is. That's something only we as humans can decide, because we have the will to do so. Despair is rejected while hope is embraced. As for the culmination of Godzilla's arc, it's just as metatextual as it is contextual. In this universe, Godzilla has been waging war on humanity since his rise in the 50s, and he never lets a single grudge go unanswered. The point of the final scene, as poorly set up as it is, presents Godzilla with the choice to forgive mankind. I have heard some speculate that Minilla wasn't necessary for this part, and Godzilla could have just as easily decided to bury the hatchet on his own, but I'm not so sure it would have worked. The whole idea of having Minilla and Kenta both taking a stand here is important. The parties who began and perpetuated the conflict are confronted by the next generation and forced to think about the future. In a way, they're both thinking about what legacy they'll leave behind, and what their children and their children's children will think of them. As such, both Godzilla and the EDF choose to stand down and let their war end. You gotta admit, Omni, those are very generous interpretations of what the movie was aiming for. Don't I know it, Snazzy? I still think these themes were executed in a very poor manner, but I can still recognize that they are present. I just want to make sure of something. You haven't really changed your mind about Final Wars, right? No. Even with all the positive stuff I've said, I stand by my initial critiques and I still don't consider it a personal favorite. Okay, so in that case, why make a positive video at all? Well, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, while attending G-Fest in 2024, I went to the Final Wars screening at the Pickwick Theater, which was one of the few such screenings that has ever sold out. The audience was having a blast watching it, and while the usual things still stood out to me, I could not deny the energy in the room. Even after a late start that kept us all awake far longer than we expected to be, people were still going nuts over this thing. They cheered whenever Godzilla won a fight, or whenever a crazy action scene happened, or whenever Don Fry existed. Even if it didn't change my critiques, it served as confirmation that perhaps it was time to make a video in which I rethought the movie a bit. This video was a long time coming, though. The truth is, I was beginning to soften towards Final Wars even before the convention. You may recall that my greatest beef with Final Wars was how it seemed to think Godzilla's time was over, which made it feel more like a funeral than a celebration. The King of the Monsters is done, and now he must let the X-Men and the Matrix guide us into the future of cinema, so says the 50th anniversary film. Here we are 20 years later, and Godzilla is not only popular, but he's outclassing Marvel, DC, the Matrix, and even Star Wars. The prediction that Wonder Lizard was down for the count once again proved untrue. As such, I don't feel as much disdain for Godzilla Final Wars' defeatist mindset because it ended up being inaccurate. Sure, it seemed like things were pretty dire at the time, but it was just a moment that passed, and Godzilla's future turned out to be bright. Plus, it's a better Godzilla anime than the actual Godzilla anime we've gotten since. Amen to that. So in the end, while I still am not overly fond of Final Wars, I don't despise it anymore either. I guess I'm gonna take a page from this movie's own book and just let my grudge go. What's done is done, and now I can look forward to a new and bright future. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. You know, if you do want to see an alternative interaction between a monster and the people it wants to destroy, you could always check out Crisis on Ulalu, but I'm not going to say anything more than that.